It is night on a narrow sea. Somewhere out in the dark between two coasts the water is moving, not violently, but steadily, the long, patient work of the tide. On the quay, the stones are wet. They are always wet here. A lantern hangs at the head of the steps, and its light does not travel far. The distance across this water is not large, 20 miles or so at the narrowest. A few hours sailing with a good wind. But men who have business on both shores spend a great deal of their lives standing on quays like this one, watching the weather, waiting for the sea to let them pass. Kings among them, especially kings. The man who ruled England for the better part of a century was very often not in England. He was on the other side of this water, because those lands were his too, and they were larger than his kingdom. How did a family build such extraordinary power, and why did the seeds of its collapse already lie inside that success? Good evening. Before the story carries us any further, let the room settle a little. It is late, wherever you are, and the point of these long nights is not that you should follow every turn. If you feel like it, leave a note below and say which corner of the world you are listening from tonight. And if there is a person or a place from the past you would like to spend a night with soon, name it, and I will read it. And if these quiet histories help you sleep, a like or a subscription is welcome, though only if you mean to come back. There is no need to hold every date or name in your mind. Names will come and go tonight, and most of them can go. Only the shape of the story matters. Let the details settle where they fall. Now, the crossing. Look again at that water, and at the shape of what lay on either side of it. England was a kingdom, and it made him a king, and it gave him a crown and a coronation and a title that other rulers had to respect. But it was one part of something bigger and stranger. A scattered inheritance of duchies and counties and lordships, reaching from the Scottish border in the north to the mountains of the south of France, held together by nothing more solid than the person of the man who held them. That is the question of tonight, and it is one question rather than two. The strength and the weakness were not separate things that happened to arrive in the same century. They were the same thing, seen from different angles. The very features that made this inheritance so formidable, its size, its spread, its dependence on one restless and capable ruler, were also the features that made it difficult to preserve. This is the story of the family that built that thing, and the 60 years in which they held it, and the way it came apart. It begins in 1154, when a young man of 21 named Henry crossed this water to be crowned King Henry II of England, a man who already held more of France than the King of France did. It ends in 1216, when his youngest son died in the middle of a civil war with a French army in the south of the country and half his barons in arms against him, and the great cross-channel inheritance already broken. 62 years, 3 kings, and a fourth who was crowned but never truly reigned. One remarkable queen, a murdered archbishop, a crusade, a ransom that emptied the treasury, a document sealed in a meadow beside the Thames whose long afterlife few could have foreseen at the time. To understand why a king of England spent so much of his life on the water, you have to understand that this arrangement was not planned by anyone. Nobody designed it. It was the result of 3 marriages, 1 civil war, and a great deal of luck, arriving in the same generation and landing on the same man. Consider what he held, this young man of 21, when he came to be crowned. From his mother, he had a claim to the throne of England, and with it the Duchy of Normandy, the land his great-grandfather had ruled before crossing this same water in 1066 to take the English crown by force. Normandy was rich, well-governed, and dangerous. It bordered the lands of the King of France directly, and its eastern frontier was a line of castles and river crossings that had been fought over for generations. From his father, he had Anjou and Maine and Touraine, the middle country, the valley lands along the Loire, with their vineyards and their stone towns, and their long tradition of quarrelsome independent lords. Anjou was his family's oldest possession, the place the name came from. Its counts had been building power there, patiently and often ruthlessly, for 200 years. And from his wife, married only 2 years earlier and in circumstances that had scandalized half of Christendom, he had Aquitaine, the vast southwest, larger than all the rest of his French lands together, stretching from the Loire down towards the Pyrenees. Aquitaine was a duchy in name. In practice, it was a great many lordships, some of them barely governed by anyone, whose nobles regarded the duke as a distant figure to be respected in principle and ignored whenever convenient. Put them together, and the shape is astonishing. From the Channel to the Pyrenees, Rouen, Le Mans, Angers, Tours, Poitiers, Bordeaux, and across the water, London and Winchester and York. Now put beside it the lands of the man who was, in theory, his lord for all the French portion of it. The King of France, in 1154, ruled directly a modest territory around Paris and Orléans, a good country, well placed, but small. On a map of raw acreage, the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou and Duke of Aquitaine held perhaps 3 times what his royal overlord did. And he was that overlord's vassal. That is the piece that makes everything afterwards intelligible. For his lands in France, the King of England knelt to the King of France and did homage, acknowledging him as his lord. He was simultaneously a sovereign king in one country and a subject in another, and the second thing was not a formality. It gave the King of France a legal hook, a right to summon, to judge, to hear appeals from disgruntled vassals, to declare lands forfeit if the terms of homage were broken. For 50 years that hook would seem almost decorative. Then a French king with better lawyers and a fuller treasury would take hold of it and pull. But that is far off. Tonight we are still on the quay, in the dark, at the beginning. Look once more at the water. It is doing what it always does, coming in, going out, indifferent to the arrangements of the men who cross it. In the harbour the ships shift on their moorings. Up on the rise, one of the 2 lamps in the castle has gone out. The clerk has finished, or the candle has. The other burns on. Somewhere south of here, on the far shore, there are roads leading inland through country that most people in England would never see, towards towns whose names they would never learn, all of it belonging to the same man who owned the field they ploughed. That was the empire, if it can be called that. A man, a family, and a sea in the middle. For the moment, on this particular night, it holds. The kingdom he came to had spent 19 years tearing at itself. This period has attracted some very memorable writing, and memorable writing can flatten a complicated thing. A monk at Peterborough produced a description of those years so bleak that it has echoed ever since. A country where men said openly that Christ and his saints slept, where castles were filled with devils and evil men, where the land was ruined and nothing grew. It is powerful. It is also local, partial, and written by someone whose own region suffered badly. The truth was patchier. Some parts of England barely felt the war at all. Harvests came in. Markets were held. Monks copied books. A farmer in a quiet county might have gone from beginning to end of the fighting without seeing an armed man he did not know. Other districts were wrecked, repeatedly raided, taxed by whichever side held the nearest castle, their villages burned to deny supplies to an enemy. The experience of the war depended almost entirely on where you happened to live. The war had begun over a succession nobody could agree on. The old king had died, leaving a daughter as his named heir and a nephew who moved faster. The daughter had a claim, supporters, and eventually a son who would outlive them all. The nephew had the crown, the treasury, and possession. The result was not one clean battle, but a long, indecisive struggle in which neither side could finish the other, and in which the real winners, for a while, were the men in the middle. Because that is what a disputed succession does. When there are two claimants, every lord in the country becomes valuable. Both sides need him. Both sides will pay. And the price of loyalty is not always money. It is permission. Permission to build a castle where none stood before. Permission to hold a royal manor and keep its income. Permission to take over the office of sheriff in a county and treat its revenues as one's own. Permission, in effect, to behave like a small king in a small territory. By the end, a great deal of royal authority had leaked out into private hands in exactly this way. Castles had gone up without license. Royal manors had been alienated. The sheriffs, who were supposed to be the crown's men in the shires, had in many places become the local barons' men, or simply their own. The machinery of government still existed, and much of it still functioned. But a good deal of what it produced was now flowing into pockets that were not the king's. And then, in 1153, the war ended, not with a victory, but with an agreement. The old king, holding the crown, had lost his son that year. The young claimant, holding much of the West and increasingly the initiative, had time on his side and no need to gamble. So they came to terms. The king would keep the throne for the remainder of his life. The young man would be recognized as his heir. When the king died, the crown would pass and the fighting would stop. It was a settlement built on the assumption that both parties would keep their word after one of them was dead. And it worked. The old king died in October 1154. And then, this is the part that tells you most, nothing happened. The young heir was in Normandy. It was autumn. The sea was contrary. He did not hurry. Nearly 2 months passed between the death of one king and the crowning of the next. In a country that had just spent 19 years in civil war, that is an extraordinary interval, a gap in which any ambitious man might have made a move. Nobody did. The kingdom simply waited, and when the winds turned in December, he crossed, rode to Westminster, and was crowned. That waiting is the most useful piece of evidence we have about the state of England in 1154. The country was not exhausted into chaos. It was exhausted into willingness. Almost everyone who mattered had concluded that another round of fighting would cost more than it could win, and that a settled king, even an untried one of 21, was worth more than another season of raids. But when authority leaks away, it does not simply flow back when a new king appears. Men who have held a castle for 15 years regard it as theirs. Men who have run a shire and kept its money regard the arrangement as normal. Grants had been made by both sides, often to the same men for the same lands, and many of those grants were perfectly genuine, sealed, witnessed, legally impeccable, and contradictory. Any attempt to sort them out would make enemies. Any failure to sort them out would leave the crown poorer than it had been 2 generations before. He set about it immediately, and with a directness that seems to have surprised people. Foreign mercenaries, the professional soldiers who had done much of the fighting, were dismissed and sent home. Castles built without royal license were ordered destroyed, and where the order was resisted, an army was brought and the castle was taken. Royal lands that had been given away were reclaimed, sometimes with compensation, often without. The men holding the sheriffdoms found themselves being audited. The Exchequer at Westminster, the great accounting session where sheriffs came twice a year to render their accounts on a checkered cloth, the counters moved from square to square while clerks wrote down the results, was pulled back into working order by men who remembered how it had run in the old king's day. Not all of this was new. Much of it was restoration, and he said so, repeatedly. His charters spoke of the rights his grandfather had held, the customs of his grandfather's time, the day the old king was alive and dead. It was a shrewd formula. It made every reclamation an act of conservation rather than innovation. He was not taking anything. He was putting things back. What made it work was not the formula, but the pace. He moved constantly. This is the single most consistent fact about the man across 35 years, and it began at once. He could not sit still. He rode enormous distances at speed, changed his plans without warning, arrived where he was not expected, and expected his household to keep up. Those who travelled with him complained about it bitterly. The sudden departures, the nights spent in bad lodgings because the court had gone further than anyone intended, the messengers sent chasing after a king who had already moved on. One clerk of his household left a description of the whole business as a kind of purgatory, a court that never knew where it would sleep, following a man who seemed to regard rest as a personal insult. But the restlessness was not a temperament only. It was a method. In a realm made of separate places, presence was power. A lord who might defy a distant king would think differently about defying one who could appear in his county within the week. Roads mattered enormously in this reign, the state of them, the speed of them, the way news and men and money travelled along them. The king's ability to be somewhere, quickly and without warning, did work that no document could do. And so, in the first years, the loosened kingdom tightened. Castles came down, accounts were rendered, sheriffs answered questions. The silver that had been staying in the counties began again to reach Westminster, and to be recorded and to be spent on the things kings spent money on: garrisons, wages, building, and the endless purchase of goodwill. What returned in those years was not peace in any general sense. It was royal authority, a different thing, and one that felt different depending on where you stood. If you were a small landholder who had spent 2 decades being squeezed by a neighboring castle, the arrival of a king who would hear your complaint was a relief past describing. If you were the man in the castle, it was the end of something. And if you were a farmer in a quiet shire who had not much noticed the war, what you noticed now was that the tax assessors had come back and were thorough. That is the shape of it. The new reign did not begin with a blank page, and it did not begin with a ruin. It began with a kingdom that had been running loose for 19 years and was being wound in again, quickly, competently, and by a young man in a hurry. The crown had survived the war. What it had become, and what it would cost to keep it in that condition, would take rather longer to see. To understand how the southern half of that inheritance arrived, we have to go back 2 years to a marriage that shocked people at the time and has been misunderstood ever since. In March 1152, in the city of Beaugency on the Loire, a church council dissolved the marriage of the King of France and his queen. The grounds were consanguinity. The couple were related within the degrees the church forbade, a fact that had been perfectly well known for 15 years and had troubled nobody while the marriage was working. Such annulments were the standard exit from a royal marriage that had failed, and this one had failed comprehensively. The Queen was Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. She had been married at about 15, on her father's death, to the heir to the French throne, and had brought with her the largest single territory in France. For 15 years, she had been Queen of France. She had gone on crusade with her husband, and returned with the marriage in ruins. The quarrel between them in the East had been public enough that chroniclers wrote about it, and hostile ones wrote about it with relish, attaching to her the kind of rumors that hostile clerics attach to any woman with power and independence of mind. We should be careful with those stories. They come from men who disapproved of her before they had anything particular to disapprove of, and they cannot be checked. What can be established is simpler. The marriage had produced 2 daughters and no son. For a king of France, that was the whole matter. 15 years, no heir, and a wife who had become politically inconvenient. The annulment was granted. The daughters remained with their father, as royal children did. And Eleanor rode south towards her own lands, carrying the Duchy of Aquitaine back out of the French crown's grasp as cleanly as she had carried it in. She was, at that moment, the most valuable unmarried person in Europe, and one of the most exposed. A duchess traveling with her whole inheritance was a prize anyone with enough men and enough nerve might take. The seizure and forced marriage of an heiress was a recognized risk, and attempts to intercept her on that journey south are recorded. She avoided them, reached Poitiers, and within 8 weeks of the annulment she was married again. 8 weeks. To the 19-year-old Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. The speed tells you it was arranged in advance, and that both parties understood exactly what they were doing. He was about a decade her junior, already formidable, already pressing his claim to England, and in possession of the northern French lands adjoining hers. She held the south and needed a husband strong enough to protect it, chosen by herself rather than imposed on her. Together, in 1 week, they held more of France than the King of France did. The King of France, who had let her go over a matter of church law and dynastic disappointment, had handed 1/3 of his kingdom to his most dangerous vassal. He was furious, and entitled to be. As their overlord, he had a right to approve the marriage of a vassal of that rank, and had not been asked. He declared the marriage a breach of faith, gathered allies, and attacked Normandy that summer. He was beaten off within weeks. That is the origin of the thing we have been calling an empire. 2 annulments away from never existing, assembled in a rush, and defended in its first summer against a furious overlord. It was not the product of a plan handed down through generations. It was made in 8 weeks by 2 people who saw an opening and took it. There is a whole literature on Eleanor as a figure of romance, courts of love, troubadours, a queen presiding over an elegant southern culture of refinement. Some of it has a basis. The ducal court of Aquitaine did patronize poets, and her own grandfather had been among the most celebrated of them. But the romantic version has grown far beyond the evidence, and it has done her a disservice, because it makes her decorative. She was not decorative. She governed. In the first 2 decades of the marriage, she was repeatedly left in charge of England while he was in France, of Normandy or Anjou while he was elsewhere, issuing writs, hearing petitions, authorizing expenditure, holding the machinery steady in his absence. In a realm where the ruler could only be in one place, a trusted deputy of unquestionable standing was a structural necessity, and for many years she was that deputy. She bore 8 children who lived past infancy, 5 sons and 3 daughters. 2 of those sons would be kings of England, 1 Duke of Brittany, 1 died young. The daughters married into Saxony, Castile, and Sicily, 3 alliances stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, arranged with an eye to hemming in France and securing the flanks of the family's lands. Royal daughters were instruments of policy. That was the age. But these marriages were unusually well chosen, and they held. And she brought Aquitaine, which is to say she brought a permanent problem, because Aquitaine did not consider itself governed. Its lords had spent generations doing very much as they pleased, and the arrival of a northern husband with northern ideas about ducal authority was not welcome. The southern nobility would rebel against this family in one combination or another for the next 50 years, and no amount of campaigning would settle them for longer than a few seasons. Eleanor's inheritance doubled the family's territory and permanently overstretched it, and both of those things were true from the first day. As for the marriage itself, the evidence is thin in the way that private life in the 12th century is always thin. The early years looked like partnership, constant movement, frequent pregnancies, shared administration, considerable trust. The later years do not. Somewhere in the 1160s, the two began to separate in practice. She based increasingly at Poitiers, running Aquitaine and raising the younger children there. He in the north and constantly in motion. Whether this was estrangement or arrangement cannot be settled from where we stand. It may have been both. In ruling families of this kind, the distinction can be almost meaningless. There were mistresses, and everyone knew it. One in particular, in the later years, seems to have mattered to him more than the others. After her death, he founded a religious house in her memory and made no great secret of his grief. Kings had mistresses, and queens were expected to look past them. But it was noticed, and it fed the stories that grew afterwards. What we can say with more confidence is that by the early 1170s, whatever had bound these two together had become something else. In 1173, when their sons rose against their father, Eleanor was among the rebels, actively, not passively. She was captured attempting to reach the French court, dressed, according to one account, in men's clothing for the ride. She would spend the next 15 years in confinement. Not a dungeon. That is a later imagining. She was held in a succession of royal residences under varying degrees of restriction, with servants, with periods when she was permitted to travel and to appear at court, and with long stretches when she was not. She was not free, and she was not to be allowed near Aquitaine or near her sons. 15 years, from her early 50s to her late 60s, spent under guard by her husband's order. She outlived him by 15 more, and used nearly every one of them. But that is far ahead. For now, hold the beginning of it. Two people on the Loire in the spring of 1152 doing something rapid and audacious that reshaped Western Europe. The marriage gave the family everything it had: the reach, the wealth, the position that made a young man of 21 the most powerful ruler in the Latin West. It also gave the family Aquitaine, which no one could hold, and a queen with lands of her own and a mind of her own, and sons who would learn from her that the man on the throne could be resisted. The union was a triumph. It was also, in its own quiet way, the first fault line, and it ran directly beneath the house. Consider a man walking to a court hearing. He is not important. He holds perhaps 30 acres in a village in the English Midlands, which he farms and which his father farmed. Some months ago, a neighbour, a bigger man with more land and a cousin in the sheriff's household, took possession of a strip of that holding and would not give it back. Under the old arrangements, his options were poor. He could complain to the lord of the manor, who might well be related to the neighbour. He could go to the county court where the neighbour's connections would be waiting. Or he could accept the loss, which is what most men in his position had always done. But now there is another road, and he is walking it. He has bought a writ, a short, standardized document purchased from the king's chancery for a few shillings, which orders an inquiry into whether he was indeed put out of his land without a proper judgment. It is a narrow question. It does not ask who ought to own the land in the deepest sense. That could take years and would involve who swore what to whom in the reign of a previous king. It asks only this: was this man in possession, and was he dispossessed without due process? 12 local men sworn to tell the truth will answer, and royal justices coming into the county on their circuit will hear the answer and give judgment. If he wins, he gets his land back, not because his lord permits it, but because the king's court says so. The men who built these mechanisms were professionals, clerks, justices, men trained in the law, working out over years how to make royal justice available, standardized, and above all, quick. The mechanisms acquired names English lawyers would still be learning 700 years later. The assizes dealing with recent dispossession, with inheritance, with disputed presentations to churches. Each turned a messy human quarrel into one specific question, answered by sworn local men rather than by ordeal, or by two men fighting with staves in a field. And each cost money to begin, which is the part that is easy to miss. The writ had a price. Royal justice was not free, and it was not equally available. You needed the fee and the ability to travel to where the justices were sitting, and enough standing to be taken seriously. Plenty of people had none of those things. But the price was low enough that a modest, free landholder could reach it, and that had never been true before. The justices went out on circuit, riding fixed routes through the counties, hearing cases, checking on sheriffs, noting what they found and carrying it back to Westminster. They were, in effect, the king's presence in the places the king could not be. In a realm this size, that was the only way it could work. The air, as the circuit came to be called, was slow and inconvenient and much complained about, since it brought fines as well as remedies. It also meant that royal authority now had a timetable. It would arrive. It arrived at Michaelmas or at Easter, in this county and then the next, and people could arrange their lives around it. Underneath all of it sat the money. The Exchequer met twice a year. It was a room, a table, a checkered cloth, and a group of very careful men. The sheriff of each county came and rendered his account. what he had collected, what he had spent on the king's order, what he still owed. Counters moved across the squares of the cloth, a physical calculation that everyone in the room could follow, in a world where written arithmetic was slow and Roman numerals were no help at all. And the results were written down on long rolls of parchment sewn end to end and stored year after year, so that the account of one year could be set against the account of the last. Those rolls survive. It is one of the reasons we can say anything at all about how this kingdom worked. What they show is an ordinary annual revenue running somewhere in the region of £10,000 to £20,000, a figure that means little in isolation, but which represented a formidable machine by the standards of the age, and which mattered less for its size than for its regularity. This king could predict his income. Very few rulers in Europe could. He could also raise more when he needed it, and the methods are worth naming because they will matter a great deal later. There was scutage, a payment made by a great tenant in place of the military service he owed, which allowed the king to turn an obligation to send knights into cash and to hire professional soldiers with it. There was tallage, levied on towns and royal lands. There were the profits of justice, fines, penalties, the fees for writs, the payments made simply to have a case heard sooner rather than later. And there were the incidents of lordship, which is a dry phrase for a set of arrangements that reached into the most intimate parts of aristocratic life. When a great tenant died, his heir paid a sum to succeed him. If the heir was a child, the king took the wardship, the custody of the lands and the enjoyment of their income until the child came of age. If the heir was a woman, or if a widow held land, her marriage lay in the king's gift and could be sold to whoever would pay. These were not abuses. They were the recognized rights of a lord, exercised by every lord over his tenants. But the king was everyone's lord. The sums at the top of society were enormous, and the temptation to charge whatever the traffic would bear was constant. A widow might pay hundreds of marks for the right to stay unmarried. An heir might spend a decade clearing the debt of his own succession. In restrained hands, this was firm lordship. In unrestrained hands, it was a machine for extracting money from the most powerful families in the kingdom, one death at a time. And every one of those families understood exactly what it was. And then there was the forest. Great stretches of the country. Estimates vary, but something between a fifth and a third at the widest extent were designated royal forest. This did not mean trees. It meant a jurisdiction, an area, wooded or not, in which the king's hunting was protected by its own law, its own courts, and its own officers, entirely separate from the common law of the realm. Inside the forest, you could not clear ground for the plough without license. You could not fell timber, or build or take game, or in some places even keep a dog large enough to bring down a deer without having its claws struck out. Villages that had farmed the same fields for centuries found themselves inside a jurisdiction where ordinary agricultural improvement was an offence. The forest courts fined constantly, and the officers who levied them were detested in a way that comes through even the driest records. For the crown, it was money and pleasure together, a hunting reserve that paid for itself. For the people living inside it, it was an arbitrary second legal system laid over the land they worked. When men eventually wrote down their grievances against this family, the forest stood near the top of the list, and it took a separate charter of its own to deal with them. So, writs, justices, the Exchequer, scutage, wardships, the forest. It is an unromantic inventory, and it is the real answer to how one man held so much. All of this was working extremely well. The English administration was becoming one of the most regular and sophisticated royal governments in Latin Christendom, with trained personnel, written records, standard procedures, predictable income. And every part of it was built to serve one man's will. The justices were his justices, appointed by him and removable by him. The Exchequer answered to him. The writs ran in his name. There was no institution with independent standing, no rule that bound him rather than flowing from him. The machine was superb, increasingly capable of running in his absence, and yet it had no reliable brake on the exercise of his will, which was manageable so long as the man at the top was competent, restrained by prudence, and interested in the long term. It became something else entirely when the same machine passed to a man who pressed every feudal and fiscal right to its limit in worse circumstances against the very families whose cooperation kept it turning. The system that made this family strong was the same system that, 50 years later, its own barons would demand be constrained in writing. They did not object to it because it was weak. They objected because it worked, and because the machinery of law and revenue could be driven far harder than custom or prudence allowed, and nothing in the structure could reliably stop it. For now, though, it was simply working. The man with 30 acres got his strip of land back. The sheriff rendered his account. The justices moved on to the next county, and the roads carried them, and the whole slow apparatus turned over once again. It looked like order, and it was order. It was also a very large quantity of power gathered into a single pair of hands, with no provision yet made for what should happen if those hands turned out to be the wrong ones. Every long reign has one wound that will not close. This one had a friendship. The man was a Londoner, the son of a merchant family of Norman descent, educated in Paris and in the law, ambitious in the way that clever men without land had to be. He entered the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury, rose quickly, and in 1155 was made Chancellor of England, the head of the Royal Writing Office, Keeper of the Seal, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful officials in the kingdom. For 7 years he and the king were inseparable. They hunted together, they quarrelled and laughed and rode together. The Chancellor lived magnificently, a household grander than the king's own, plate and horses and hangings, embassies conducted with a display so lavish that the French are said to have wondered aloud what the master must be like if this was the servant. He raised money for the king's wars efficiently, including from the church, and the church noticed. He was, by every measure, the king's man. Which is precisely why in 1162, when the see of Canterbury fell vacant, the king put him in it. The logic was straightforward and, on its face, sound. The church in England was an immense institution, landowner on a vast scale, employer, educator, holder of its own courts and its own law. Its relationship with the crown had always required management, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was the hinge of that relationship. Put a loyal servant in the chair, and church and crown could be run in harness. Put a stranger in it, and you had a rival. He did not want it. He warned the king more than once that if he took the office he would have to serve it, and that their friendship would not survive the change. The warning was taken for modesty. He was appointed and consecrated, and within a very short time he resigned the chancellorship, dismissed the splendid household, and began to live like a churchman of the strictest kind. The transformation has puzzled people for 800 years. Was it conversion? A man genuinely seized by the duty of an office he had not sought? Was it the logic of the role which required him to defend the rights of Canterbury or be despised by every cleric in Europe? Was it pride or theatre or some combination even he could not have separated? We cannot know. What we can see is that from the moment of his consecration he took the Church's side in every dispute with an absoluteness that made compromise almost impossible. The dispute that broke them was, of all things, a jurisdictional one. The question was, what should happen when a man in holy orders committed a serious crime? Under church law, clerics were tried in church courts, which could not shed blood. The heaviest penalty available was degradation from orders, loss of status, penance. Under royal law, a layman who committed the same crime might hang. The Crown's complaint was simple. There was one law for ordinary men and a far gentler one for anyone who could demonstrate clerical status. And that status reached a long way down, well past priests, into the great population of men in minor orders who could read a verse of scripture. Murders were being committed by men who then walked out of a church court with a penance. The king wanted such men, once degraded by the church, handed over to the royal courts for punishment. The archbishop said the church could not deliver its own to a secular sword, and that to punish a man twice for one offense was against divine law. Both positions were defensible. Neither man would move. In 1164, at Clarendon, the king put his case in writing, clauses setting out what he claimed were the ancient customs of the realm regarding the church, covering the criminous clerks, appeals to Rome, the election of bishops, and much else. He required the bishops to assent. Under pressure, most did. The archbishop assented, then almost immediately repudiated his assent, declaring he had sinned in giving it. That repudiation converted a legal argument into a personal betrayal, and the king never afterwards spoke of him in any other terms. What followed was 6 years of escalating, exhausting conflict. A council at Northampton where the archbishop was arraigned on financial charges from his time as chancellor and, in a scene that his own clerks never forgot, walked out carrying his cross before him like a man expecting to be struck. Flight by night to the continent. 6 years of exile, spent moving between French monasteries, writing letters, appealing to the Pope, and wielding the one weapon he had, excommunication pronounced on royal servants, threatened against the realm itself. 6 years is a long time, and both men aged in it. The Pope, caught between a powerful king he needed and an archbishop whose cause was legally strong, temporized endlessly. The French king sheltered the exile for reasons that had rather more to do with Normandy than with theology. In 1170 there was a reconciliation of sorts, negotiated on a field in France. It settled the personal quarrel and none of the substance. The archbishop returned to Canterbury on the 1st of December to crowds who came out to meet him in the Winter Road. He had brought with him letters of suspension and excommunication against the bishops who had taken part, in his absence, in the crowning of the king's eldest son, a ceremony that was Canterbury's ancient right to perform. Whether he was defending his office or lighting a fire is exactly the kind of question that has no answer. He did it, and the aggrieved bishops crossed the sea at once to complain. They found the king in Normandy at Christmas and told him what had been done. And here we come to the sentence that has echoed for 8 centuries. And here we must be careful, because we do not actually know what he said. Several chroniclers report an outburst. The wordings differ. One version has him crying out about the wretched drones and traitors he had nourished in his household, who let their lord be shamed by a low-born clerk. Another has something closer to a lament than an order. The famous English phrasing about a turbulent priest is a later rendering, elegant and probably not his. What all the accounts agree on is that a king in a rage said something in a hall full of armed men about being rid of the man, and did not think about who was listening. 4 knights of his household were listening. They left the court without leave, took ship, and rode to Canterbury. What happened there on the 29th of December is one of the best attested violent events of the Middle Ages, because a member of the Archbishop's own household stood in the church and watched it and wrote it down afterwards. The knights came first in the afternoon, unarmed, and there was an argument in the Archbishop's chamber, loud and going nowhere. Then they went out to arm. The monks tried to bar the cathedral door. He would not have it barred. "A church," he said, "is not a castle." It was the hour of Vespers, and the building was not empty. There were monks in the choir and townspeople in the nave, and the light would already have been failing at that time of year. The knights came in through the cloister door in mail, with swords drawn, calling for the traitor. They tried at first to drag him out. Killing a man inside a cathedral was a horror even they seemed to have wanted to avoid. And he resisted, holding to a pillar, and it went wrong in the way such things do. He died on the pavement of the north transept in the near dark, from wounds to the head. It took very few blows. The knights rode out. They had, in their own understanding, done the king a service. They had, in fact, destroyed his argument entirely, because the news went out across Europe in weeks, and it went out in the simplest possible form. An archbishop cut down at his own altar by the king's household knights. Every subtlety of jurisdiction, every reasonable point about the criminous clerks and the customs of the realm vanished. What remained was blood on the stones of a cathedral, and a king who had spoken in anger. The reaction was immediate and enormous, and it did not stop. Within days, people were coming to the cathedral. Within weeks, there were reports of miracles at the tomb. Within 3 years, he was canonized, and Canterbury had become one of the great pilgrim destinations of Christendom, drawing crowds across the Channel and up the roads from London for the next 3.5 centuries. The king's response was, first, terror. He shut himself away for days, refusing food, and then, characteristically, negotiation. He denied ordering the killing. Whether that denial is true depends on what one means by an order, and the honest answer is that no order can be proved and no order was needed. He swore before papal legates that he had not commanded it, accepted penance, abandoned the disputed clauses on appeals to Rome, and conceded on the criminous clerks. The substance of what he had fought for since 1164 was given up. 2 years later, in July 1174, with his sons in rebellion and his lands in danger, he came to Canterbury as a penitent. He walked the last stretch of road barefoot. At the tomb he was scourged by the monks, a number of strokes from each by his own request, and spent the night on the stone floor of the crypt. Within days, in the north, the King of Scots was captured at Alnwick in a fog, and the northern rising collapsed. Contemporaries drew the obvious conclusion, and they drew it loudly. The saint had been appeased, and the king's fortunes had turned at the very hour of his humiliation. Whether the penance was sincere or political or, most likely, genuinely both at once, is beyond us. What can be said is that it worked, in the only sense a medieval king would have recognized. He submitted publicly to the dead man he had made, and the world took it as settled. But nothing was really settled. He had won the crisis and lost the argument. The church courts kept their clerics. Canterbury kept its saint and its pilgrims and its enormous moral weight, a permanent monument in stone and candlelight to the limits of what an English king could do. And he had learned, in the most public way available, that a king's anger is not a private matter, that words spoken in a hall are picked up and carried and acted upon by men eager to please, that he could be obeyed too well. It is a lesson about power that his sons might usefully have learned from him. As far as one can tell from what they did afterwards, none of them did. The problem with a realm assembled out of separate inheritances is that it has to be given away in separate inheritances, and no one ever worked out how. He had 4 sons who reached manhood, and the eldest was given his father's own name, Henry, the boy who would become the young king in this story, born in 1155. Then came Richard, born in 1157, Geoffrey in 1158, and John, the youngest, in 1166. An older boy, William, had died in infancy. Between them came the daughters, Matilda, Eleanor, Joan, who were married abroad and who mattered, though the sources care less about them than they should. He could not simply hand the whole to the eldest. The lands had come from different sources, they had different customs, and the French portions were held from the King of France, who had views about how his vassals' territories were arranged. Aquitaine in particular had come through Eleanor and was hers. It had its own expectations about who its duke should be. Brittany had come by marriage and conquest into the family's orbit and needed its own count. So he divided them. The eldest would have the patrimony, England, Normandy, Anjou, the core, the crown. Richard would have Aquitaine, his mother's inheritance, and Eleanor took him south and had him invested there among her own people, in Poitiers and in Limoges, in ceremonies designed to bind him to the duchy rather than to his father. Geoffrey would have Brittany through a marriage arranged in his childhood to its heiress, and John, born last when everything was already allocated, would have nothing. The chroniclers give him a nickname for it, Lackland. He was, as a small boy, the one child of the most powerful man in Europe with no territory of his own, and it is difficult not to see the whole of his later career pressing outward from that fact. The plan had a symmetry to it. Each son placed in a land, each land in the family, the whole held together by the father while he lived and by fraternal loyalty afterwards. On parchment, it works. In practice, it contained a flaw so basic that it seems astonishing nobody addressed it. He gave them titles, and he did not give them power. Consider the eldest. In 1170, at 15, he was crowned King of England during his father's lifetime. An unusual step, borrowed from French practice, intended to secure the succession beyond dispute. It was from this coronation, performed by the Archbishop of York in Canterbury's absence, that much of the final Becket crisis flowed. So the boy was a crowned and anointed king from his mid-teens. He was given no revenue he controlled, no castle he could garrison as he chose, no county he could actually govern. He had a household paid for by his father, an allowance set by his father, and a father who showed no sign of stepping back. He was a king with an allowance. He was also, by every account, precisely the sort of young man for whom this arrangement was most corrosive, charming, spectacularly generous, adored by the young knights of the tournament circuit, and entirely without judgment. He spent enormous sums he did not have. He was the finest ornament of his father's court and had no function in it. As the years passed, still crowned, still allowanced, still without a single county he could call his own, the humiliation of it became the central fact of his life. Richard, in the south, had a different experience, and it made a different man. Aquitaine was ungovernable, he had to govern it, and he was 15 or 16 when he began. He spent his young manhood in the saddle in a country of hostile castles and shifting alliances, learning siegecraft the only way anyone learns it. And by his mid-20s he was among the most capable soldiers in Europe. He was also a duke who had actually ruled, which none of his brothers could say. Whatever else Aquitaine did to that family, it made Richard. Geoffrey had Brittany and a reputation among the chroniclers for eloquence and duplicity in roughly equal measure. One of them called him a son of perdition, which is strong even by monastic standards. He was the family's negotiator and its most reliable maker of alliances against whoever currently held the advantage, the least remembered of the four, and possibly the cleverest. And John grew up as the afterthought, the youngest by 8 years, raised partly in an abbey, educated well, promised at various points lands that turned out to belong to somebody else. An attempt to provide for him in the early 1170s, transferring 3 castles in Anjou to him as part of a marriage arrangement, was one of the direct triggers of the rebellion of 1173, because those castles sat in territory his eldest brother regarded as his. Even the attempt to fix John's landlessness detonated. Behind all of this sat the deeper structural fact. The lands were bound together by a person, not an institution. There was no council of the whole, no shared treasury, no common law running from Northumberland to the Pyrenees. Such a thing cannot be delegated by halves. Either you keep it or you give it away. He tried to do both, and the result was 4 sons with the dignity of rulers and the position of dependents, in a family where the dependency would end only when the father died, and he was, infuriatingly, in excellent health. And there was a 5th player watching all of this with great attention. The King of France from 1180 was a young man named Philip, son of the man Eleanor had left, born late to a father who had almost despaired of an heir. He was not a soldier of the first rank and never pretended to be. What he had was patience, a lawyer's mind, and a very clear understanding of one fact. Every one of these sons was, for their French lands, his vassal, which meant that when a son of the house of Anjou quarrelled with his father, he had somewhere to go. He could ride to Paris and be received as a wronged man seeking justice from his rightful lord. Philip would listen, offer support, and thereby convert a family argument into a matter of feudal law in which the King of France was judge. He would do this, with variations, for 30 years, and it worked every single time. So the inheritance plan was not merely inadequate, it was an invitation. It created 4 discontented men with legitimate grievances and a nearby overlord delighted to hear them. Their father's answer, when the discontent surfaced, was always the same. He would fight, win, forgive, restore them to their positions, adjust nothing about the underlying arrangement, and be astonished when it happened again. He was one of the most acute political minds of the century in every arena but this one. Within his own family, he could not do the one thing required, let go of something while he was still alive to see it used. In 1173, 3 of the 4 sons, the youngest was 7, rebelled against him simultaneously, backed by their mother and the King of France. It would not be the last time. It would not even be the worst. The rebellion began, as these things often do, with a young man leaving a dinner table. In the spring of 1173, the eldest son, 18 years old and crowned 3 years earlier, slipped away from his father's court by night and rode for Paris. His grievance was the one he had been nursing for years, sharpened by the recent decision to hand 3 Angevin castles to his infant brother. He was a king with no kingdom, and he wanted lands he could actually hold. His father had refused, so he went to the man who was, in law, his lord for Normandy, his own father-in-law, the King of France, and asked for help. He got it immediately. Within weeks, his 2 next brothers had joined him, riding south and then north to gather support. Their mother, in Poitiers, worked to bring the Aquitainian lords in behind them and then attempted to reach Paris herself. She was intercepted on the road. And then the thing spread in a way that reveals how much resentment had been banked up over 18 years. The Count of Flanders came in, the Count of Boulogne. The King of Scots came south across the border with an army, hoping to recover the northern English counties. And in England itself, a substantial group of earls and barons declared for the sons, men who had lost castles in the 1150s, men who had lost sheriffdoms, men whose families felt the weight of the wardships and the fines, men who had simply concluded that the old king was finished and it was time to be on the right side. They were wrong about that, and their error is instructive. He was not finished. He was 40, in the middle of his powers, and he had 2 advantages his enemies had underestimated. The first was money. 18 years of Exchequer discipline meant he could pay soldiers when his opponents could not. He hired Brabançon mercenaries, professional companies, expensive, brutal, and available to whoever had silver, and he moved them by ship and by road with the speed that was his signature. Feudal armies dissolved when the season ended or the food ran out. Paid armies stayed as long as the payments did. The second was that his own administration held. This is the quiet, decisive fact of the war. The justiciar in England, the man left in charge in the king's absence, kept the machine running, raised money, garrisoned castles, coordinated the loyal barons, and put down risings without waiting for instructions from across the sea. The Exchequer, the sheriffs, and the royal justices, wound back into working order in the early years of the reign, turned out to be able to defend the settlement they served. The fighting lasted about 18 months, and it was not a campaign so much as a scattering of sieges. Castles invested, castles surrendered, columns marching between them through country that paid for their passage. An army in the field ate. It ate whatever was within a day's ride, and it did not pay. Where a district supported the wrong side, its crops were burned deliberately to starve a garrison and to punish. This was not exceptional cruelty. It was the ordinary technology of medieval war, applied by both sides, and its victims were the people who happened to farm the land between the castles. There is a way of measuring it afterwards, in the Exchequer rolls. Manors recorded as waste, revenues down, mills not working, sums written off as unrecoverable. Behind each entry is a season in which somebody's family did not eat what they had grown. In July 1174, the king crossed to England, sailing in weather his sailors advised against, which was habitual, and went straight to Canterbury to perform the penance we have already seen. Days later, the King of Scots was taken at Alnwick, caught in fog with a small escort while his army was dispersed. The northern rising folded. The English rebels, deprived of their most substantial ally, began surrendering their castles through the autumn. By the end of the year, it was over. He crossed back to France, forced the French king to terms, and received the submission of his sons. Then he forgave them. The sons were pardoned, completely, restored to their titles, given increased allowances, and treated publicly as young men misled by bad advice. The rebel barons were treated with a leniency that surprised contemporaries. A few lost lands, most did not, and there were no executions of any note. The illegal castles came down, which was the one substantive gain, and the crown emerged administratively stronger than before. And the underlying arrangement was left exactly as it had been. The eldest son was still a crowned king with an allowance. Richard still held Aquitaine at his father's pleasure. Geoffrey still held Brittany on the same terms. The grievance that had produced a war across two countries was addressed by raising the pocket money. Only one person was punished, and she was punished for the rest of the reign. Eleanor was taken to England and confined. She was 50 or thereabouts, and would be released at 67 by her son on the day her husband died. 15 years, from the prime of a political life into old age, spent under guard in a series of comfortable rooms. He never explained it and never reversed it. There is no way to read this except as it appears. The sons were forgiven because they were the future, and she was not forgiven because she was the one betrayal he could not bear. She had been the partner in the enterprise. She had helped build the thing, and then she had tried to break it, and for that there was no absolution. The peace held for 5 years, in the sense that there was no general war. Underneath it, everything went on rotting. In 1183 it came apart again, and this time between the brothers. The eldest, still landless in any real sense, now approaching 30, demanded that Richard do homage to him for Aquitaine, an assertion of the seniority he had been promised and never received. Richard, who had spent a decade subduing that duchy castle by castle, refused absolutely. Their father tried to arbitrate and produced a formula that satisfied nobody, and the eldest went into Aquitaine with an army, allied with Richard's rebellious lords, and set about taking his brother's inheritance by force. It was a squalid campaign. To pay his troops, he plundered monasteries, including a famous shrine at Rocamadour, from which he took the treasury and a sword said to have belonged to a hero of legend. Then, in June, in a small town in the Limousin, he caught a fever, dysentery most likely the common killer of armies, and within days he was dying. He sent for his father. His father, who had been deceived by him before, suspected a trap and did not come, though he sent a ring as a token. The young king made his confession, asked pardon for the rebellion and for the plundered churches, and asked also that his mother be released from her confinement. He died on the 11th of June, 28 years old, having been a crowned king for 13 years and having ruled nothing at all. His father's grief was reportedly terrible, and it surprised people, given everything. But grief is not a settling of accounts. He wept for a son he had loved and could not bring himself to trust with a single county, and both of those things had been true at the same time for years. The death also created a problem, immediately, and he handled it as badly as he had handled everything else in this line. Richard was now the eldest. Richard should therefore have England, Normandy, and Anjou, and the father's proposal was that Richard should accordingly surrender Aquitaine to John, the youngest, the one with nothing. Richard refused, and he was right too. Aquitaine was his mother's inheritance. He had been invested in it as a boy, and he had spent his entire adult life fighting for it. He was being asked to hand it over on a promise to a 17-year-old brother who had never governed anything, in exchange for lands he would receive only when his father died. And his father was 50 and looked capable of another 20 years. He had watched exactly what an expectation was worth. His elder brother had been crowned King of England at 15 and had died at 28 with an allowance. So he said no and rode south and fortified his castles. His father, in a decision it is hard to characterize as anything but rage, permitted John and Geoffrey to invade Aquitaine and try to take it. They did, unsuccessfully and destructively, in 1184. The following year he ordered a stop, summoned everyone, patched together another agreement, and left the succession question precisely where it had been. By the mid-1180s, the shape of the last act was set. Geoffrey died in Paris in 1186. Some chroniclers said he was trampled at a tournament. Others attributed his death to a sudden fever. In either account, he had spent his final months in close and friendly conference with the King of France. John was growing up in a family where the one lesson available was that nothing is given, only taken. Richard held the south and would not release it, and Philip of France sat in Paris with a lawyer's patience, receiving each aggrieved son in turn. The old king still had every advantage he had ever had: money, administration, experience, a reputation that made men hesitate. He simply could not bring himself to let go of anything while he lived. And so the last thing he had built, the family, which was supposed to carry the whole arrangement into the next generation, was already, by his own hand, coming apart in front of him. The end, when it came, was quick and unusually pitiless. In 1188, Philip of France and Richard rode together, ate together, and were reported to be inseparable. It was theatre aimed at the old king, and it was effective. The following summer they moved against him jointly. He was ill, a long-standing complaint, worsening, and for the first time in his life he was slow. They took Le Mans, the city of his birth, in June 1189, and he had to ride out of it as it burned. He fell back into Anjou, exhausted, and at Ballon agreed to terms he would never have accepted in health. Richard recognized as heir to everything, homage to Philip, an indemnity, and castles surrendered as security. He asked for the list of those who had conspired against him. John's name was at the head of it. The chroniclers say he turned his face to the wall. 2 days later, on the 6th of July, 1189, he died at Chinon, 56 years old, and was carried to Fontevraud. Richard came to the abbey to see the body, and what he did next is the first act of his reign. He ordered his mother released. She had been in confinement for 15 years. She was 67. She came out and immediately began to govern, riding through England ahead of her son's arrival, ordering the release of prisoners. taking oaths of loyalty to the new king, doing the work of settling a kingdom before its king had even landed. Two things about this deserve saying. The first is that she was extremely good at it. The second is that she had been prevented from doing it for 15 years, and there is no sign that the interval had cost her anything at all. Richard was crowned at Westminster in September 1189, 31 years old, at the height of his physical powers and with a reputation as the finest soldier in Christendom. He had one aim, and he made no attempt to disguise it. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187, and the whole of Latin Christendom was mobilizing. Richard had taken the cross before his father's death. He intended to go, and he intended to go quickly, and everything else, England, Normandy, Anjou, the government of the family's lands, was a resource to be converted into the means of getting there. The scale of the fundraising was extraordinary. Offices were sold. Sheriffdoms went to the highest bidder. Charters of liberties were granted to towns for cash. Men bought their way out of obligations and into positions. The King of Scots purchased release from the homage extracted after Alnwick for 10,000 marks. Richard is supposed to have said that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. A remark that may be apocryphal, but which everyone who dealt with him that year would have recognized as true in spirit. He left England in December 1189, having been in the country for about 4 months. In the whole of his 10-year reign he would spend perhaps 6 months in England. Now, before this becomes the familiar complaint about an absentee king who did not care for his kingdom, it is worth being accurate, because the familiar version is too simple in both directions. It is quite true that Richard was not interested in England as a place. He spoke French, so had every king since 1066. He had grown up in Aquitaine and thought of the south as home. England was, in his view of the world, the wealthiest and best organized of his possessions, and therefore its most useful function was to pay. But it is also true that England was governed perfectly well without him. The machinery kept running for a decade with the king 3,000 miles away. Justices heard cases, sheriffs rendered accounts. The Exchequer met twice yearly. Writs issued. Taxes were assessed and collected and shipped abroad in enormous quantities. Whatever else the reign proves, it proves that the administration his father built no longer required a king in the room. It required, however, someone in charge, and here the arrangements went wrong quickly. The Chancellor Richard left as chief minister was capable and detested, a Norman churchman with a talent for antagonizing the English baronage, and by 1191 he had been driven out of the country by a coalition that had John at its head. John, whom Richard had made rich in land before departing precisely to keep him quiet, spent the whole of the crusade attempting to build a party of his own. And it was expensive beyond precedent. The crusade itself, then the ransom, then, on his return, 10 years of war in France to recover what had been lost while he was away. This is the reign in which English royal taxation became genuinely heavy, and in which the mechanisms his father had used with restraint were used without any. The crusade is not our story, and I will keep it brief. He fought his way east, taking Cyprus on the journey, and he was formidable. At Acre, at Arsuf, on the road to Jaffa, he handled armies with a competence his enemies acknowledged freely. Muslim writers who had every reason to despise him wrote about his generalship with respect. He came, by most accounts, within a day or two's march of Jerusalem twice, and both times turned back, because taking the city would have been possible, and holding it, once the crusading army dispersed, would not. He is said to have refused to look at the city when it came into view, on the grounds that a man not worthy to capture it should not presume to gaze on it. He made a truce with Saladin in 1192, 3 years, the coastal cities retained, pilgrims guaranteed access to Jerusalem, and turned for home. And then the thing that defines his reign in English memory. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, travelling overland in disguise through hostile territory, he was recognized and taken near Vienna in December 1192 by the Duke of Austria, whose banner he had insulted at Acre. The Duke handed him to the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Emperor, holding the most valuable prisoner in Europe, named a price. 150,000 marks. The figure needs context to mean anything. It was in the region of 2 to 3 times the annual royal revenue of England, and it had to be raised in a hurry from a country already squeezed hard for the crusade. It was raised. That is the astonishing part. A general levy took a quarter of the value of movable goods and of income from every free man in England. The churches gave up their plate. The Cistercians, who had none to give, contributed a year's clip of wool. The silver was gathered, counted, sealed in chests, and shipped to Germany under guard. Eleanor, now over 70, oversaw much of the operation and then travelled to Germany herself to bring her son home. Consider for a moment what this looked like from the bottom. A parish church in a small English village where the chalice has been taken away and something plainer put in its place. A widow assessed at a quarter of the value of the animals in her yard in a year when she had planned to keep them. A monastery's wool clip, the whole year's income going out on a cart. No one who paid had ever seen the king. Very few of them could have told you where Germany was. The tax was collected from them anyway by men with lists, and their contribution disappeared over the horizon in chests. The wealth of the country was portable, and it went where the family's needs took it, to Palestine, to Germany, to Normandy, and no institution existed that could ask whether this was a reasonable use of it. He was released in February 1194. He returned to England, was crowned a second time to wipe away the stain of captivity, pardoned John. His mother arranged the reconciliation, and Richard is said to have called his brother a child who had been badly advised, which was generous about a man of 27, and left again within 2 months. He never came back. The last 5 years were spent on the French frontier, recovering the Norman castles and border districts Philip had taken during the captivity, and he recovered nearly all of them. He was, at the business of war, simply better than Philip, and the French king avoided battle with him as a matter of policy. And he built. On a rock above a bend in the Seine, at the eastern gate of Normandy, he raised Château Gaillard, a fortress of concentric walls and layered defences designed by a man who had seen the fortifications of the East and learned from them, thrown up in about 2 years at a cost that may have approached £12,000. It was one of the most expensive single structures in Europe, and it was meant to say something. That the Seine Valley was closed, that Rouen was safe, that this frontier would hold. He is supposed to have called it his beautiful daughter, and to have boasted that he could hold it if the walls were made of butter. 5 years after his death it fell, and Normandy fell with it. He died in April 1199, at a minor siege in the Limousin, over a dispute about treasure found in a field. He walked the perimeter one evening without full armor. A crossbow bolt took him in the shoulder, and the wound turned septic. He was 41. He was buried at Fontevraud, at his father's feet, at his own request. Weigh him, then, in the quiet. He was a magnificent soldier and a serious ruler of the only kind his position permitted. The lands he inherited were held together by war, and he was better at war than anyone alive. He recovered what had been lost, secured the frontier, and left the family's territories at his death essentially intact. And he had spent in 10 years sums that no previous English king had imagined, on purposes that had almost nothing to do with the country that produced them. He had no legitimate child. He left the whole arrangement, England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, the ungovernable south, the watchful king in Paris, to a brother who had spent the last decade trying to take it from him. The empire was intact on the day Richard died. It had also just been drained twice over to pay for a war in Palestine and a prison in Germany. The strength was still there on the surface, and underneath it the money was gone. For the moment, the walls looked solid. Gaillard stood on its rock above the river, new stone bright in the sun, and the Seine ran quietly beneath it towards Rouen and the sea. He was 32 when the news reached him, and the succession was not clear. This is worth stating plainly because the later story is usually told as though John were the obvious heir who then failed. He was not obvious. There were 2 candidates. John was the last surviving son of Henry II. Arthur of Brittany was the son of Geoffrey, the 3rd brother, dead 13 years. And by one line of reasoning, the son of an elder brother takes precedence over a surviving younger brother, even if that son is a child. The custom was genuinely unsettled. Different territories leaned different ways, and they said so. England and Normandy accepted John, largely because the men who mattered there knew him and preferred an adult. Anjou, Maine, and Touraine declared for Arthur. Aquitaine followed Eleanor, and Eleanor supported John, her last surviving son, and the only one who could hold the duchy against the French. And Arthur, 12 years old, was in the custody of the King of France, who had recognized his claim and would spend the next 4 years using it. So John began with a contested title and a rival held by his enemy. What kind of man was he? The monastic chroniclers who supply most of what we know detested him, and they had reasons that were partly personal. He quarreled with the church catastrophically, and monks wrote the histories. Their portrait is of a man cruel, faithless, lecherous, irreligious, and cowardly. That portrait cannot simply be inverted, but it should not be swallowed either. Set against it the administrative record, which has no motive to flatter. A king genuinely interested in the details of government, who sat in his own courts and heard cases in person, understood the Exchequer as few kings did, improved the keeping of records substantially. The chancery rolls from his reign are far fuller than anything before, and moved around England with an energy that reminds you whose son he was. Some historians rate him the ablest administrator of the 3. His failures were of a different kind and more dangerous than incompetence. He could not make men trust him, and he could not trust them. He suspected, and the suspicion showed, and it made the suspicion true. He would humiliate a man publicly and then expect his service. He took hostages from his own barons, sons, wives, as security for loyalty, a recognized practice pushed by him past the point where it read as security and into the register of threat. He was inconsistent, harsh where mildness would have served, conciliatory where firmness was needed, and unpredictable enough that no one around him could work out how to be safe. Then there was the marriage, and the marriage is where the reign begins to break. In 1200 he set aside his first wife, an annulment on grounds of consanguinity, standard enough, and married Isabella of Angoulême, heiress to a county sitting astride the route between Poitiers and Bordeaux. Securing Angoulême was a genuine strategic objective, and marrying its heiress was a rational way to do it. Isabella was, however, already betrothed. Her intended was Hugh de Lusignan, head of one of the most powerful families in Poitou, and the betrothal was public. To take another lord's promised bride was a serious insult in a society that ran on such arrangements, and John made no attempt to soften it. No compensation, no negotiation, nothing. The Lusignans rebelled, which was predictable. He harried their lands, which was conventional. And then they did what the family's enemies had learned to do. They appealed to the King of France. Philip received them, and here everything that has been sitting quietly in the background for 50 years comes to the front. John was Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Duke of Aquitaine. For all of it, he was Philip's vassal. Philip was his lord, and a lord's court was where a vassal's tenants could seek justice if their lord denied it to them. The Lusignans said John had wronged them and refused them a hearing. Philip, as overlord, summoned John to Paris to answer. John did not come. From his point of view, the summons was absurd. He was a crowned king, and kings do not stand in another man's court. But in law, he was not being summoned as King of England. He was being summoned as Duke of Normandy, and the Duke of Normandy owed attendance. In 1202, Philip's court gave judgment. John, having failed to appear, was in default of his obligations, and his French fiefs were declared forfeit. 50 years earlier, the same court had had no power to make such a judgment stick because the King of France could not enforce it. That was what had changed. Philip's revenues had grown steadily. His administration had been reformed in imitation of the very system across the water. His royal domain had expanded. He now had the money to put an army in the field and keep it there. And so the legal fiction that had let this family hold half of France while owing homage for it, the fiction that homage was a formality, was called in, and it turned out to have been real all along. Philip declared Arthur the rightful holder of the forfeited lands and invaded. There followed, in the summer of 1202, the one clear military success of John's reign, and it is worth giving him credit for it because there is not much else. Arthur, now 15, had gone south with a Lusignan force and had laid siege to the castle of Mirbeau, where Eleanor, 80 years old and still at it, was holding out in the keep. John was 80 miles away. He marched through the night, arrived at dawn, and took the entire besieging force by surprise. Arthur was captured. The Lusignan leadership was captured. His mother was relieved. It was a brilliant stroke, executed with a speed his father would have recognized, and it should have ended the war. He held his rival's principal allies, and the initiative. Within 18 months he had lost Normandy. He treated the prisoners badly, not the ordinary hard confinement of high-value captives, but conditions that shocked contemporaries. Some of the Poitevin nobles taken at Mirbeau died in irons at Corfe. Others were shipped to England in chains through the streets, on public display. Ransom and honourable captivity were the expected currency. A lord who was captured expected to be dealt with as a lord. What John did instead advertised that he would not observe the conventions, and it made the calculation for every noble in his French lands very simple. Submission would not be safe. And then there was Arthur. The boy was moved to Falaise, then to Rouen. In April 1203 at Rouen, he disappears from the record entirely and is never seen again. What happened is unknown and will remain so. One chronicle, written some years later at an abbey with Welsh marcher connections, states that John killed him personally in a drunken rage and had the body weighted and thrown into the Seine. Other sources say nothing or hint or report rumours. There was a story that an earlier order to blind and castrate the boy had been refused by the man holding him. None of it can be verified. What can be established is that Arthur was in John's custody, that he vanished, and that within a very short time everyone in Normandy and Brittany believed John had murdered him. The belief mattered more than the truth. Brittany, Arthur's own duchy, went into permanent and implacable hostility. And across Normandy, among the lords who would shortly have to decide whether to fight for John or come to terms with Philip, the story settled into the general understanding of what kind of man this king was. He had inherited a contested throne, an emptied treasury, and a French king who had learned how to use the law. He had then, in 4 years, given that king the two things he most needed: a legal pretext, and a reputation among the Norman nobility that made defection look less like treason than like prudence. The lands were not yet lost, but the loyalty that held them had been spent, and loyalty cannot be raised by a levy. Normandy did not fall in a battle. There was no field, no charge, no day on which a herald could have said, "Here it ended." It came apart the way a rope comes apart, one strand at a time, quietly, until the remaining strands cannot take the weight. Begin with the money, because the war was decided there before it was decided anywhere else. For a century, the balance had run one way. The English king was richer than the French king, and the difference paid for castles, mercenaries, and the purchase of loyalty. By 1200 that gap had closed and was reversing. Philip's revenues had roughly tripled over his reign, through the recovery of royal rights, better collection, the growth of Paris and the towns, new territory. Meanwhile, the English crown had paid for a crusade, a ransom of 150,000 marks, and 5 years of frontier war, and the currency had been losing value for 2 decades, so the same nominal revenue bought less each year. Philip could now afford to keep an army in the field through a whole campaigning season, and then the next one. That single fact reorganized the war, because the defense of Normandy depended on castles, and castles are only as strong as the relief force behind them. A castle under siege is a hostage. It holds and waits for its lord to come and break the siege. If he comes, the siege lifts. If he does not come, the castle falls eventually, always, whatever its walls are made of. Philip's method was patient and unglamorous. He would take one castle, garrison it, and move to the next, offering generous terms to lords who came over, confirmation of their lands, guarantees, an orderly transfer. He was punctilious about keeping those terms, which was itself a weapon, because every lord who was well treated became an advertisement to his neighbours. and John did not come. He was in Normandy through much of 1203, and what he did there is one of the strangest passages in the reign. He moved between castles. He did not concentrate his forces. He would announce a campaign and then not begin it. Contemporary observers, some sympathetic, describe a king unable to commit, who spent the season reacting, and who was reported at one point to have been at leisure in Rouen while a critical siege was pressed a day's ride away. The chroniclers, who hated him, attributed this to sloth and to infatuation with his young wife. Those accusations may tell us more about their hostility than about his calculations. A harder possibility fits the political circumstances. John may have doubted whether his own Norman lords would remain beside him in a decisive battle. Whatever passed through his mind, the reliability of his army had become a genuine strategic problem. That was the practical consequence of everything in the previous chapter. He did not know which of his Norman lords would stand and which would ride off at the decisive moment. A commander who suspects his own line cannot maneuver. He can only garrison and hope and avoid the test. It is a paralysis born of an accurate assessment. The defections had already begun, and they accelerated through the year, and each one confirmed to the rest that the Duke could not protect them. Which brings us to the rock above the Seine. Chateau Gaillard had been built to be the answer to exactly this situation. The fortress that closed the river, that no army could take, that would hold the eastern gate of Normandy while a relief force gathered. Philip arrived beneath it in September 1203 and settled down to prove otherwise. The siege lasted about 6 months through the winter, and it is remembered for 2 things: the engineering and the townspeople. Philip did not attempt to storm the outer works. He built ditches, palisades, towers, a bridge of boats to cut the river, siege engines brought up and emplaced, a whole encircling apparatus constructed around the rock so that the fortress was sealed and the besiegers were fortified against relief. Then he began, slowly, to take the defences apart. The outer bailey was mined and fell. The middle bailey was entered by a party that got in, according to the accounts, through a latrine chute and an unbarred chapel window, which is the sort of detail that survives because it is humiliating. The inner defences were undermined at last, and the garrison, reduced to a fraction of its strength, surrendered in March 1204. They had held for 6 months without relief. There is no criticism to be made of them. The townspeople are the part that should stay with you. When the siege began, the civilian population of the settlement below the castle, some hundreds of people, took shelter inside the walls, as they were entitled to expect. As the food ran down, the garrison commander put them out, in batches, to save the supplies. Philip's army let the first groups through the lines. Then he ordered that no more be allowed to pass. So several hundred people, mostly old, mostly women and children, spent the winter in the ditch between the castle walls and the besieging lines. They could not go up, and they could not go out. They lived there for weeks, in the cold, through Christmas, on whatever could be thrown down to them or found. Accounts of what they were reduced to are grim and probably not exaggerated. When Philip finally relented and let the survivors through, a number of them died shortly afterwards from eating properly again after starvation. They were not soldiers. They had no part in the quarrel over homage and forfeiture. They were the people who had lived at the foot of the rock. and their winter is the truest available picture of what the loss of Normandy actually meant to the people who lived in it. When Gaillard fell, the rest went quickly. Rouen, the capital, the great city, the seat of the duchy since the days of the Northmen, asked for a truce of 30 days to appeal to its duke for relief. The request was granted. Messengers went to John in England. He sent no army. The reply, as reported, was that they should make what terms they could. Rouen surrendered on the 24th of June, 1204. Normandy was French. Anjou, Maine, and Touraine had already gone or went within the year. Aquitaine held, partly because Eleanor's authority there had counted for something, partly because Gascony's wine trade ran to England and its merchants preferred it that way. When Eleanor died at Fontevraud on the 1st of April 1204, in her early 80s, she had outlived her husband, 2 of her sons, and the duchy her marriage had joined to Normandy. She was buried beside them, husband, son, and eventually daughter-in-law, 4 effigies in one church in a country that was no longer theirs. For John personally, it was catastrophic in a way that is easy to underestimate. He lost the majority of his territory, most of his continental revenue, and the base from which the family had operated for 150 years. He acquired a nickname, Soft Sword, and a project that would consume the rest of his reign, getting it back. For the barons of England, the effect was more complicated. Many of the great families held lands on both sides of the water. That had been the whole logic of the arrangement. A lord with a Norman patrimony and English estates, subject to one man for both. Now there were 2 men, and they were enemies, and a lord could not do homage to both. So the families had to choose, and they chose, and estates were divided. A branch stayed in Normandy and swore to Philip. A branch stayed in England and swore to John. And the double allegiance that had defined the aristocracy since 1066 came to an end. A few managed to hold both for a time. Most did not. The consequence, unintended and enormous, was that the English baronage became English. Their estates, their futures, and their children's marriages were in England, and their attention narrowed to it. This mattered immediately, in a way John never seems to have grasped. When he taxed them relentlessly for the recovery of Normandy, he was asking men who had just written off their Norman lands to pay for a war to recover somebody else's. When he demanded that they serve overseas in Poitou, they asked whether the service was owed at all. Before 1204, England paid for France. After 1204, England was all there was, and everything the Crown did to get France back had to be done to England, and to Englishmen who no longer had a stake in the outcome. He spent the next 10 years preparing. He raised money on a scale never seen, built a fleet, made alliances in Germany and Flanders. He was, in his own grim way, methodical about it, and the war chest he assembled was formidable. The barons paid for all of it, and watched him, and remembered the men who had died in irons at Corfe, the boy who had disappeared at Rouen, and the hostages taken from their own households as security for a loyalty they had not yet withheld. Above the Seine, the new stone of Gaillard was already weathering, and the river ran on beneath it exactly as before, carrying barges down to Rouen, where a French garrison now held the walls. Between the loss of Normandy and the meadow beside the Thames lie 11 years, and they are not empty. They are the years in which a king systematically converted every legitimate power of the crown into money, and in doing so used up the last of the thing money cannot buy: Start with the church, because that quarrel came first and it set the tone. In 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury died. The election of a successor was disputed in the usual way. The monks of Canterbury had a claim, the bishops had a claim, the king had expectations, and the matter went to Rome. Innocent III, the most formidable pope of the Middle Ages and not a man to be managed, set aside the competing candidates and appointed his own, Stephen Langton, an Englishman, a distinguished scholar at Paris, and by any reasonable standard an excellent choice. John refused to accept him and refused to let him into the country. The escalation was rapid. In 1208, the Pope laid England under interdict. This did not close the churches entirely. Baptism continued and the dying could be confessed. But the ordinary sacramental life of the country stopped. No mass, no marriage in church, no burial in consecrated ground. For 6 years, the dead were buried in ditches and unblessed ground. People who had planned their weddings waited, and the church bells did not ring. In a society where the parish church was the frame of every life event, the weight of that is hard to overstate. In 1209, John himself was excommunicated. He responded by treating the interdict as a source of revenue. He seized the property and revenues of the churches whose clergy had gone into exile or refused to serve, and administered them for the crown. The sums were very large. Estimates vary widely, but the church lands were among the richest in England, and he held many of them for years. It was, from a purely fiscal standpoint, one of the most profitable decisions of his reign. It was also 6 years of the entire ecclesiastical establishment being systematically robbed, and those were the men who wrote the histories. A very great deal of what posterity thinks it knows about John was written by people whose churches he had emptied. In 1213 he gave way, suddenly and completely, and in a manner so extreme that it wrong-footed everyone. He accepted Langton. He agreed to compensation. And then he went further. He surrendered the kingdoms of England and Ireland to the Pope and received them back as a papal fief, doing homage and agreeing an annual tribute. It looked like abject submission, and it was, in fact, a shrewd stroke. Philip of France had been preparing an invasion of England with papal blessing. Overnight, John became the Pope's own vassal, and an attack on him became an attack on the Holy See. The invasion was called off. And when, 2 years later, his barons rebelled, the king had the papacy on his side, which would matter enormously in what followed. Meanwhile, the taxation went on, and its character had changed. The mechanisms were the old ones we have already seen at work: scutage, reliefs, wardships, marriages, fines, the profits of justice, the forest. What was new was the intensity, and a kind of deliberateness in the way the machinery was turned against individuals. Scutage had been levied only 7 times in the whole of Henry II's 35 years. John levied it 11 times in 17 at steadily rising rates, including in years when no campaign followed. Reliefs, the sum an heir paid to succeed to his father's lands, had settled around a customary figure for a barony. John charged what he chose. Some heirs were charged sums that could not possibly be paid, and the point was that they could not be paid. The debt then hung over the man permanently, to be demanded whenever the king chose, and he was thereby owned. The clearest case, and the one everybody knew about, was William de Braos. He had been one of John's closest associates, a beneficiary of royal favor for years, and something went wrong between them. His wife was said to have spoken openly about the fate of Arthur, which may or may not be the true cause. John called in his debts in full, immediately. Browse could not pay. He fled to Ireland and then to France. His wife and eldest son were caught and imprisoned at Windsor or Corfe, and they starved to death in captivity. That was a great baronial family, destroyed not by rebellion but by the enforcement of debts the king had every legal right to enforce. There was nothing unlawful in it, and there was no protection against it, and every magnate in England understood the implication precisely. Add the hostages taken routinely from noble households, the private grudges pursued through the courts, the suspicion that the king's justice could be brought against you as easily as bought by you, and you have a baronage that is not merely resentful, but frightened. Then, in 1214, the war came, and it failed. The plan was genuinely good. John would land in Poitou and drive north. His allies, the Emperor Otto, the Count of Flanders, the Count of Boulogne, would strike into France from the northeast, catching Philip between two forces. It had taken 10 years and an immense treasure to assemble. John's own campaign in the south went reasonably at first, and then collapsed when his Poitevin lords declined to face the French prince in the field. And on the 27th of July at Bouvines in Flanders, Philip met the Allied army and destroyed it in a single afternoon. Bouvines is one of the decisive battles of the European Middle Ages, and John was 200 miles away when it was fought. It confirmed Philip's mastery of France, it broke the German alliance, and it ended permanently any realistic prospect of recovering Normandy and Anjou. John came home in October 1214, having spent everything and achieved nothing. And now the arithmetic that had been building for a decade came due. 16 years of extraordinary taxation, a treasury emptied, a war lost without a battle being fought by the king who paid for it. Nothing whatever to show. And immediately, on landing, a demand for scutage from those who had not served. The refusal came from the north first, and then spread. By the spring of 1215, a substantial group of barons had renounced their homage, the formal act that severed the bond and made resistance lawful in their own understanding, and had put together a set of demands. Langton, the Archbishop John had fought for 6 years to keep out, was among those working to mediate, and it is likely that his hand shaped the drafting. An old coronation charter of Henry I, promising good government, was dug out and used as a model. In May, the rebels took London, and that decided it. With the capital gone, John had to negotiate. They met in a meadow by the Thames at Runnymede, between the royal castle at Windsor and the rebel camp at Staines, in the middle of June 1215. Neutral ground, chosen because neither side would enter the others. Picture it without ceremony. Wet grass by a river in mid-June. Tents, horses picketed. 2 armed camps a few miles apart, and a great many men who had known each other for 20 years, some of them related, standing about in a field while clerks went back and forth with drafts. There was no throne, no assembly hall. There was a river and a lot of waiting, and men arguing over clauses. What they produced was not a constitution. It was a peace treaty, drawn up to end a specific rebellion, and most of it is astonishingly practical. It is about reliefs, fixing the sum an heir must pay so the Brao's treatment could not be repeated. It is about wardship, forbidding the guardian to strip the estate of an underage heir. It is about widows who are not to be forced to remarry and who are to have their inheritance without paying for it. It is about scutage, which is not to be levied without common counsel. It is about the forest and the disafforestation of land brought in during the rain. It is about fish weirs on the Thames and the Medway, which obstructed navigation. It is about standard measures for wine, ale, and cloth. It is about foreign mercenaries, who are to be sent out of the kingdom, and named individuals who are to be dismissed from office. It reads, in short, like exactly what it was: a list of everything a particular group of men had found intolerable, written down by people who wanted specific things to stop. And then, among the practical detail, 2 clauses that would turn out to have a life far beyond the meadow. That no free man shall be taken or imprisoned or dispossessed or outlawed or exiled or in any way destroyed, nor will we go against him or send against him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. And to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. It is essential to be honest about what those words meant in June 1215. A free man was not most men. The majority of the English population were unfree villains, and the Charter does very little for them. The peers in question are one's equals in status, which for a baron means other barons. The clause is a demand that the king stop destroying great men by administrative action, by calling in debts, by seizure without judgment, by the kind of thing that happened to the Brao's family, and that he use his own courts instead. That is a narrower thing than it later became. It is not nothing either. Written into a sealed document, the principle that the king's power over a man's body and lands must run through law rather than through the king's will is a genuinely new kind of statement, whatever its authors intended by it. What the barons actually cared most about was the enforcement clause, and it was the enforcement clause that killed the settlement. 25 barons were to be elected, and if the king breached the charter and did not put it right within 40 days, those 25 could seize his castles and lands until he did, a legalized right of rebellion embedded in the peace. No king could accept that permanently, and John did not. He sealed the charter in June and wrote to the Pope in July. Innocent, John's overlord now, and a pope with strong views on subjects coercing anointed kings, annulled it in August, in language of considerable heat, shameful, demeaning, unlawful and unjust, and null and void of all validity forever. The charter had been law for about 10 weeks. By September, England was at war. The rebel barons, having lost their document, did the only thing left and offered the crown to Prince Louis, the son of Philip of France, who had a claim through his wife and, more to the point, an army. The charter mattered later, and it mattered because of what happened after John was dead. It was reissued in 1216 by the regents of his infant son as a statement of the good government that his reign would offer, and reissued again in 1217 with the forest provisions split into their own charter, and again in 1225 in the definitive version, and confirmed repeatedly for the next 2 centuries until it became simply part of the furniture of English law. Then, 400 years on, lawyers and parliamentarians looking for weapons against the Stuart kings rediscovered it, read it very creatively indeed, and made of those 2 clauses about lawful judgment a foundation for arguments its drafters would not have recognized. That afterlife is real and important. It is also not what happened in the meadow. What happened in the meadow was that a defeated king met a group of frightened, angry magnates in wet grass by a river, and they wrote down the specific things they wanted him to stop doing, and he agreed, and neither side believed him. For the moment, it seemed enough. It was not even a pause. The last year of his life was spent on the road, in a country that was no longer entirely his. The war that resumed in the autumn of 1215 went well for him at first, which is one of the small ironies of the reign. He was, when cornered, an energetic campaigner. He took Rochester after a siege of some weeks, undermining the great keep, the miners' tunnel propped with timber and the props fired, by tradition using the fat of 40 pigs so that the corner of the tower came down. Then he marched north in the depth of winter, through country most commanders would not have attempted in that season, burning and taking castles as far as Berwick, and broke the northern rebels' hold. His mercenary captains were thorough, and the destruction they left behind was considerable. But taking castles is not the same as regaining a kingdom, and while he was in the north, London stayed rebel, and Louis prepared. The French prince landed in Kent in May 1216 with a substantial force and marched unopposed to London, where he was received with ceremony and proclaimed king by the rebel barons and the citizens. Within weeks he held Winchester and much of the southeast. The King of Scots came south and did homage to him. Something over half the English baronage had now declared for a French prince, and a good number of the rest were waiting to see. He spent that summer doing what he had always done, moving. West to relieve pressure, east to Lincolnshire, back and forth across the Midlands with a shrinking household, a treasury carried in carts, and an army of paid men who would serve while the money lasted. In October he came into East Anglia, took Lynn, fell ill there, dysentery almost certainly the disease that killed his elder brother and a great many better provisioned men, and turned west, still travelling, because a king who stops moving is a king who has stopped. And somewhere in the crossing of the Well Stream, at the edge of the Wash, part of the baggage train was lost. The story has grown in the telling. The crown jewels of England swallowed by quicksand, treasure still buried under the silt of the fens. The reality was more mundane and quite bad enough. The tidal flats there are crossed at low water along routes that must be known and timed, and the column was caught by the tide, or by the softness of the ground, or by simple mismanagement, and carts, pack animals, men, and a portion of the moving household treasure went into the water. How much is unknown. It was not the whole of the treasury. It was, to a king already ill and short of money, one more thing. He reached Newark 2 days later, gravely sick, and could go no further. He made his will there, a short document, drawn up in haste, appointing 13 executors, asking for burial at Worcester near the shrine of a saint he had favoured, and commending his sons to the Pope and to the men still loyal to him. He confessed. He was, according to those present, calm at the end. He died in the night of the 18th or 19th of October 1216, at Newark, 49 years old, with a French prince in London, half his barons in arms, and his kingdom divided. And then the strangest thing in this entire story happened, which is that his death solved the problem. His heir was Henry, aged 9. Within 10 days the boy was crowned at Gloucester, not at Westminster, which was in rebel hands, and not with the crown of England, which was unavailable, so a circlet was used, possibly his mother's. William Marshal, then approaching 70, who had served every king of the family since the young king of 1170, took the regency, and the papal legate stood beside him. And their first act was to reissue Magna Carta. Consider what that did. The rebel barons had risen against a specific man for specific reasons, and had invited Louis in because there was no other way to make John keep his word. Now John was dead. The charter they had demanded was being offered freely by the government of a 9-year-old who had done nothing to anyone, and the case for a French king had lost most of its content. The defections began at once and did not stop. Louis was beaten at Lincoln in May 1217 in a battle fought in the streets below the cathedral. A French reinforcement fleet was destroyed off Sandwich in August, and in September he took a payment, went home, and gave up his claim. The dynasty survived. Henry III would reign 56 years, longer than his father and both his uncles together. But the thing that had existed on that night at the beginning, the web of lands from the Channel to the Pyrenees held in one pair of hands, was gone, and it did not come back. What remained was England, Gascony in the far south, and a very long memory of what had been lost, which would cost the English crown a great deal of money and a great many lives over the next 200 years, as one king after another crossed the water to try to get it back. How did this family build such extraordinary power, and why did the seeds of its collapse already lie inside that success? They built it fast, and largely by accident. 3 inheritances and a marriage landing together on one man of unusual capacity in a generation when the King of France was weak. They governed it with real skill: the writs, the justices, the exchequer, the roads, the constant motion of a ruler who could be anywhere within the week. That machinery was among the most regular and sophisticated in Latin Christendom. It worked. It rested on a personal union of lands that did not share one government. The writs, the exchequer, and the itinerant justices could keep England functioning without a king in the room. Richard's long absences had already proved that. But those institutions did not turn Rouen, Winchester, and Bordeaux into a single state, and none of them could reliably restrain a ruler who chose to use the instruments of government without limit. Administration had acquired continuity. The wider inheritance still depended on dynasty, while its political breaks depended on custom, negotiation, resistance, and, too often, the self-command of the man directing it. It rested on a legal fiction. Half of it was held by homage from a king in Paris, and the arrangement was safe only while that king was too poor to insist. When the fiction was called in a court, through the forms of feudal law, forms that Philip wielded skillfully and that John and his supporters contested bitterly. There was no answer to it except force, and force had become the one thing John could no longer reliably field. It rested on English wealth. The revenues of a kingdom with one of the most regular and sophisticated administrations in Latin Christendom were portable, and they went abroad, to crusade, to a German prison, to Norman castles, to a failed alliance in Flanders. When the continental lands were lost, the demands did not stop. They intensified on the only province left, whose lords no longer had any interest in the outcome. And it rested on trust, which is the one thing none of them could manufacture. The father could not trust his sons with power while he lived, and so they rebelled. The sons could not trust each other. The youngest could not trust anyone, and made himself untrustworthy in the process, and lost a duchy because his own lords would not stand in the line beside him. Each of those was, at the time, a strength, one man's energy, a cheap legal formality, a rich and taxable kingdom, a family that could hold a great inheritance together. The strengths were real. They simply had their failure written into them from the start, and the 62 years between the coronation and the death at Newark were the time it took for that to become visible. That is the whole of it, and it does not resolve into a lesson. They were not fools. They were among the most capable rulers of their age, and the ablest of them built things that outlasted the empire by 800 years. The courts, the records, the habit of royal justice, and, by an accident nobody at Runnymede intended, a charter. Now let the details go. You do not need to keep the names. Go back, if you like, to where we started. It is night on a narrow sea, and the tide is doing what it has always done, lifting and lowering the hulls in a harbour on the northern shore. The stones of the quay are wet, salt in the mortar, salt in the rope. Somewhere out in the dark, the water moves between two coasts that are, tonight, two countries, and will stay two countries. Up on the rise, the castle is a shape against the sky, and one lamp is still burning behind a narrow window. A clerk, perhaps, finishing a roll of parchment by candle, writing down what was collected and what was spent, in a hand that will still be legible in 800 years. The other lamp went out some time ago. There is a ship in the harbour that will cross in the morning if the wind allows. There are roads on the far shore leading inland, through country that belongs now to somebody else. And the sea between them keeps moving, unhurried, indifferent, the way it did before any of this and the way it will afterwards. Let the lamp burn down. Let the tide go out. Sleep well.